This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
To start off with something that's becoming a bit of a catchphrase for me is, when you've met one person who's grieving, you've met one person who's grieving. When you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There's a reason we call it the spectrum.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Dr. Kenneth Doka and Alex Lamorie of the Hospice Foundation of America's Autism and Grief Project are my guests today. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice podcast is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode is sponsored by Odonata Care, creators of the Hospice Care Plan. Hospice agencies and end-of-life doulas are now using the Hospice Care Plan booklet to support their patients and caregivers. It's become a trusted resource in the end-of-life community, helping to educate and equip caregivers. Visit thehospicecareplan.com today to purchase the Hospice Care Plan booklet. The sponsor for this week's episode is Barbara Carnes Books, featuring the work of award-winning hospice RN educator Barbara Carnes. BK Books is proud to offer the End-of-Life Guidelines series, a compilation of 5 essential education booklets designed to support those caring for terminally ill loved ones. Visit bkbooks.com today to order the End-of-Life Guidelines series to support your journey of compassionate caregiving.
Man, I've got a great duo, dare I say a dynamic duo, as my guest today. Dr. Kenneth Doka is here with me today. Dr. Doka holds a PhD and an MDiv. He's the Senior Vice President of Grief Programs at the Hospice Foundation of America. He's also the recipient of the 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Death Education and Counseling. Dr. Doka is a prolific author and editor and lecturer. He is a past president of ADEC, the Association for Death Education and Counseling, and he's received numerous awards for his work in the death, grief, and bereavement space. His other half of the dynamic duo is Alex Lamorie. Alex Lamorie is an undergrad student at the University of Maryland Global Campus, and he is an autism advocate. He serves as an advisor on the Hospice Foundation of America's Autism and Grief Project. His expressive grief artwork was featured in 2021 in a textbook called Superhero Grief, The Transformative Power of Loss, and you're going to hear a lot about this book. In his spare time, Alex loves movies and TV shows as well as traveling to Comic-Con, and he loves spending time in New York and enjoys creative writing. This is a topic we haven't tackled before on the podcast, and I think you're going to really find it interesting because I absolutely fell in love with it once the conversation got started. We're talking about the grief needs and the grief expressions of people with autism. And these folks that are my guests, Dr. Ken Doka and Alex, are the experts. Dr. Doka is going to be explaining the beginnings of the Autism and Grief Project from the Hospice Foundation of America. And they're going to be talking, both of them, about how people with autism express their grief. Dr. Doka is going to be sharing how bereavement professionals can assist people with autism who are experiencing grief. And Alex He's going to talk about his artwork and how that helps him to process his feelings of grief. And we're also going to be talking about how his artwork has been featured in a book about autism and grief. You're going to love that conversation. We got very deep into the superhero world, and I think I tapped into my inner superhero nerd. I liked it. Alex is also going to share a quote that he lives by. There's some great camaraderie between these two. They really are a dynamic duo when it comes to being advocates and voices for the needs of people with autism and dealing with grief. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Alex Lamorie and Dr. Ken Doka. I am thrilled to have Alex and Dr. Ken Doka with me today. Guys, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast.
Thank you for having us. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I'm delighted to be with you today.
I'm so glad to see you guys. We're going to have a great conversation. This is a unique topic for us today on the podcast after 7.5 seasons. So this is going to be a really new, unique topic for my listeners to have. And I think it's going to be so valuable. We're going to start with just an easy question that's sort of an icebreaker to get to know you guys a little bit. So Dr. Ken Doka, what is your go-to self-care habit these days?
I think just spending time with my family is one of the things that I like to do for self-care. I always like to hike. I like to ride a bike a little bit. So just getting out with other people or even by myself, getting off the chain of the desk. Good self-care.
Very nice. Okay, Alex, so here's your question, because I know you live in New York, right?
No, I live in Virginia.
You live in Virginia.
I live in New York.
You live in New York. Well, but Alex, you like to visit up in New York, and you know where all the good places to eat are, right?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay, so where would you say is the best place to find pizza?
Oh, okay. To be honest, I'm gonna have to split that into two different answers. Personally, with personal bias, has to be a shout out to Spontino's at it's Spontino's at Willis Park, whatever. I forgot where it is. That's personal bias, but unbiased, no personal connection. Honestly, I can't really answer that. It's all at the day. It all ends up a personal preference. So I may like a pizza restaurant that you don't like, and you end up, at the end of the day, it's all you need.
Well, the good thing is there are plenty of places to get good pizza up in New York, and I'm a fan of all of it. So your personal bias is okay with me.
Thank you. And I just I got the word Williston Park. That's where Spontino's is.
Spontino's. I might have to check that out.
Shout out to Williston Park.
Yum.
Spontino's.
All right. Well, we've got some really great stuff to talk about today. We are thrilled to talk about the Autism and Grief Project from the Hospice Foundation of America. You guys are both doing some very important work there. So, Dr. Doka, I want to start with you. Tell me about the Autism and Grief Project.
Well, a number of years ago, the NLM Family Foundation put forth a request for grants and to help deal with autistic adults, because there really aren't many resources for adults with autism. There are a number of them for children with autism, but none for adults. So we at the Hospice Foundation applied for that grant and did receive it. We have a international reputation for doing grief education, and so that's what we started to do. It's a one of a kind really project. Its mission is to help adults and the people around them navigate and cope with grief. And again, what I think is unique is we often prioritize and should. I'm not saying it's unimportant, the grief of children, but we spend a lot more time in our life in adulthood than we do in childhood. And this is a wonderful project for adults, and we have all kinds of resources available on that webpage, as we'll talk about. Testimonials from people who have dealt with grief. For instance, Ralph Brown
shares why it was so difficult for him to share emotions and talks about his own grief journey. We have award-winning animations and social stories where people talk about, again, their own experiences and what kinds of things help them. So it's been a project that we've that's been an incredible growth experience, I think, for everybody at the Hospice Foundation ourselves as we had to really delve into this area and really look at it in greater depth.
Yeah, it's some really amazing work and resources. And one of the reasons your work is so robust is that you have an advisory board that includes these folks that deal with autism and are on the autism spectrum and have had their own grief experiences as adults. And they are very generous, like Alex, to share their stories and talk about what their experience has been like. So, Alex, why would you say that these conversations about the grief needs of people with autism are so important?
Well, to start off with something that's becoming a bit of a catchphrase for me is when you've met one person who's grieving, you've met one person who's grieving. When you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There's a reason we call it the spectrum, an autism spectrum disorder. So some individuals might present different symptoms at different varying levels than others. And so that makes grieving for autistic individuals, persons with autism, much more unique, but also a lot sort of harder to, not treat, but a lot harder to sort of, I just deal with, is because it's so unique. It's the scientific community has always been, similar experiences. So we, a lot of things we usually base our knowledge, our hypotheses off of similar experiences. So we can group common symptoms. But because autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum, there's no real common symptoms that you can use to base a standardized or at least sort of baseline treatment off of. So it's sort of, you have to find a way to treat each person individually, and they each go through their own grief journey uniquely. And so you have to find a way, and that's why resources like this are so valuable, is because it can help you find a baseline to help your whoever you're trying to help with their grief journey.
I think what you're saying is reflective of how grief is. One of the things it says on the your website is that grief is also a spectrum. Right? So it doesn't look the same for each person. So when you're looking at someone who also deals with autism, their grief needs are very unique. And the Hospice Foundation of America, through your project, also has resources for professionals that help to support grieving adults with autism. So, Dr. Doka, let's toss this one to you. What kinds of grief responses do people with autism have? And I realize that's going to span, right? We just talked about, Alex said there's a spectrum to it.
Yeah.
And what kind of resources do you have for end-of-life workers and grief workers that are supporting them?
Okay. Well, let me deal with the second question first, since it's the easier one. And one of the things that I think makes this website so unique, and anyone can get on it. It's simply autismandgrief.org. So it's very easy, autismandgrief.org. And one of the things I think that makes it unique is there are really you mentioned two of the audiences, persons with autism as well as professionals, but it also has another portal or another personal caregivers, for family members, for friends, on how to support them. So what makes it unique? Well, one of the things that autism tends to do is it affects how people with autism interact and how they communicate. And again, some particularly may not even be maybe non-speaking, non-verbal. And it makes it difficult then for people with autism to process their emotions and impacts their responses to death. It helps that their support system knows that even though they may not show it in the traditional ways, that they obviously are grieving. So for instance, some of the behavioral changes, and again, I really want to reemphasize what Alex said. It's grief is a unique experience, and autism is a very individual experience. So, for instance, people can engage in self-stimulation and soothing experiences. They may find it difficult to talk about it. They may have emotional outbursts. They may be crying, or maybe even no crying. Um, there may be no outward change. So you're wondering, does this person really even understand that his father has died? Because he doesn't seem to be responding. But just because they're not showing grief in the way that people normally show it doesn't mean that they're not experiencing it. Others may regress or have, and grief is. Uh, when I used to teach about grief, I always used to say grief is stress. It's a particular type of a stress reaction, and again, stress can be very, very difficult. Coping with stress can be very difficult when you're dealing with autism as well. It can affect our bodies, and that's often the case where we call these conversion reactions. So when somebody, for example, can't explore their emotions about grief, and that includes people with autism and people without autism for one reason or another. People who have such tight emotional control. What happens is that often it becomes what we call converted to physical reactions. So it literally, the pain of grief can literally manifest itself as a pain. And of course, in a population that may be a little bit fragile in terms of change, it creates great anxiety because, one of the tasks of grief is to adjust to changes that this loss brings. And sometimes these changes can be relatively minor, but sometimes these changes can be extremely major and may involve a whole series of significant stressful changes like relocation or moving or all kinds of things. So it's tough to deal with grief in general for everybody. But sometimes some of the issues that occur in autism make it even tougher.
I have not heard that conversion response.
Reaction. You want a good example of that?
Yes, please.
I had a student when I was talking about this. I had a student who, and my students are graduate students, so they had some experience in the world, and I remember as I talked about this, she started shaking her head and saying, in agreement. And I said, Marianne, you want to share something? She said, yeah. She says, when my husband died, she said, I had this tremendous pain in the back of my neck and my shoulders. And we did all kinds of tests, and the physician, looked at everything, did MRIs, all that stuff. And he said, Mary, listen to your language. And she listened to her language, and she found herself saying that ever since Tom died, this is all on my shoulders. It's all on my neck now. She was raising some young children. So literally, because she, was just so busy and so involved and trying to hold things together and trying to support her children, not really paying attention to her own grief, literally that pain, it's the neck and the shoulders became the source of really extreme discomfort and pain.
Yeah, that's where her grief manifested physically.
That's where it's converted, yeah.
Yeah. Well, in hospice, we talk a lot about mind, body, and spirit connection.
Sure.
Right? You can't experience psychological stress without it affecting the body, without it affecting you mentally and spiritually. So that makes a lot of sense. I am loving this conversation, but we're going to take a break right now. There's more to come.
If you're a hospice caregiver looking for resources to enhance your care, look no further than the Hospice Care Plan, A Plan to Comfort. Available in both English or Spanish, this invaluable resource is designed to support caregivers in providing the best possible care for their loved ones. The Hospice Care Plan from Autism Care now has integrated QR codes in each section of the booklet. Readers simply scan the code with a smartphone, and a free playlist of videos provides practical tips for caregiving and symptom management. It's like having a personalized guide at your fingertips. Caregivers will find 150 videos offering expert advice and practical guidance to navigate every aspect of caregiving. Hospice agencies and end-of-life doulas are now using the Hospice Care Plan booklet to support their patients and caregivers. It's become a trusted resource in the end-of-life community, helping to educate and equip caregivers. Visit thehospicecareplan.com today to purchase the Hospice Care Plan booklet. Empower yourself and the ones you care for with the Hospice Care Plan, a plan to comfort. That's thehospicecareplan.com. The sponsor for this week's episode is Barbara Carnes Books, featuring the work of award-winning hospice RN educator Barbara Carnes. BK Books is proud to offer the End of Life Guidelines series, a compilation of 5 essential education booklets designed to support those caring for terminally ill loved ones. At the heart of this bundle is Gone From My Sight, affectionately known as the Hospice Blue Book, a timeless resource that has touched over 40 million lives. This bundle is more than just information. It's a lifeline for families navigating the difficult stages of the dying process, offering guidance for the last months, weeks, days, and hours. Trusted by end-of-life workers nationwide, the booklets provide direction for managing symptoms, explain the dying process, address pain medication use, and offer suggestions for moving forward with grief. The End of Life Guidelines series bundle from Barbara Carnes equips you with knowledge and tools to provide the best possible care. The bundle helps hospice agencies better educate patients and families, providing easy-to-understand guidance that can improve scores on their CAHPS satisfaction surveys. It's the ultimate caregiver's companion. Use it as part of your care plan today. Visit bkbooks.com today to order the End of Life Guidelines series to support your journey of compassionate caregiving.
So, Alex, I want to talk some about your personal story. So, you lost your dad when you were a kid, and within a year, you lost both your grandparents, someone who had been a caregiver for you, and your family dog all at the same time within the span of a year.
Yes, but not right after when my father died. That was my father was when I was 6. That was the grandma, Grammy, the caregiver, and Shadow were 2015 through 2017, and then my recent loss of my step grandmother was this year, a couple months ago. I wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. That's a lot of loss, Alex. What were your responses like?
So,
can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, so I just we'll split it into 3 parts to address each incident. When my father died, I honestly don't really remember it that much. And I think the most significant memory I have of it was when I went to school the next day, or when I went back to school, and they announced it over the loudspeaker. That's honestly, it's very vague, and it's like the one significant memory I have of it. For my grandparents, nanny, and my dog, to start with, the most significant reaction was my grandparents. Back to back, I went to a very specialized high school called the Frost School. They had a very significant impact on my life, but they also had summer school. And so because my grandparents, their end of life happened around the summer, my mom and I would have to be constantly in back and forth from New York to visit them, do hospice care and all that. And this had a severe upending reaction on my social life, but also my school life. And I had to double down on schoolwork to make sure I wouldn't fail summer school in the classes. And that caused even more stress on my plate, having to play catch up. And for my nanny, it was just like that. She got diagnosed with leukemia, 6 months later, gone. And it just happened so fast that I could barely even have any time to react to it. And Shadow, the family German Shepherd, German Shepherds usually live an average 10 to 12 years, but she managed to soldier on for an impressive 15 and a half years. And for me, it was those last couple months realizing, sort of having to come to terms with the fact that she was dying, that old age was finally catching up with her. There were times where I would just sit down and just cry. I remember one significant incident it was like 5 a.m. I woke up And I went downstairs and just sat with her and cried my eyes out, really sort of realizing what was coming. And for third part, my step grandmother, she lived in Indiana, so I didn't see her as often as I did my other relatives, and so I didn't get to form as strong of a connection with her. And for me, because of that, this sort of produced an opposite reaction with my grandparents, my nanny, Shadow, and I'm assuming my father. I, was devastated. I was crying my eyes out and all that, but for her, it was sort of muted. And I guess it was because I didn't share as powerful a connection with. That didn't mean I didn't love her. I really did, but I didn't have as powerful a connection with her, which really produced this sort of muted reaction to her death.
So, Alex, I'm hoping that you had some good support from your caregivers and the rest of your family when these losses were happening. What did you find helped you best to bring you comfort?
Well, I was hoping you'd ask this question. I've discovered what I like to call your UGT, or your unique grieving tool. This is something that I've discovered that everyone has their own, unique way that they grieve, that they channel the emotions regarding their grief. For me, as a huge superhero fan, I discovered that my unique way of grieving was taking the feelings, the thoughts, the frustration, the rage, the despair, and channeling them into these sort of characters in my head. Sometimes they'd be one-offs, sometimes they've stuck with me for years. And so was my sort of unique way of grieving. I would craft these characters and I would use them to process and deal with the emotions in an imaginary setting in my head. And so that's really how I found comfort in my grieving process. And I believe everyone has their own unique UGT.
That's very creative. You are an artist, and I know you like superheroes. So did the characters that you created like that, did they have superpowers that addressed your feelings?
Varying range of things. Some of them were good, some depending on how I was feeling, some of them were good, some of them were bad, some had powers, some didn't. Some had, legitimately justified motivations, some didn't. It was all really dependent on how I'm feeling. Some of them were one-offs just for one particular scenario, and some of them have been stuck with me for decades. Not decades, years.
That's a really cool way to deal with grief. I love the creativity there. Awesome.
Thank you.
So while we're talking about that, your artwork, I read online, was featured in a book called Superhero Grief, The Transformative Power of Loss. And I guess we've covered that, but I definitely want to mention it because that's a really cool way, very unique. And I wonder if there are other people who are creative like that who could benefit from that type of art.
I can name one. My mother, she wrote the book.
Yes, she did. That's right. I'd forgotten about that.
It's all right. So I believe there are some people. For me, everyone learns in their own unique way. For me, I've always been a visual learner more than an audio one. And so, I need to, I can read things, but I've always been more of a visual thing. Everyone learns in their unique ways. And some are orthodox, some are unorthodox. And so really, it was my love of superheroes that, it rubbed off on Mom, and then we would have conversations about superheroes. It eventually drove her to write Superhero Grief, Transformative Power of Loss. But yeah, I believe there are people out there who would 100% benefit from my mother's book and its particular brand of teaching.
Dr. Doka, since we're talking about this kind of thing, so you have a chapter in Superhero Grief. What was your contribution in the book?
Well, the book is an edited book, and what I did is with my late co-author, we did a lot of work, Terry Martin and I, on grieving styles, different ways that people grieve. Again, stressing the individuality of grief. Originally started out as a study on gender. Do women grieve differently from men? And of course, the answer was to that, some do and some don't. So we explored that into what we called grieving styles, which are affected by gender, culture, personality, a whole series of factors. And so my chapter was on Batman, who really had what we called the dissonant grieving style. So by the time we finished with Batman, he had therapy, and he no longer needed to be Batman, which was kind of controversial a little bit to Jill, I think, who I think would have preferred, this is Alex's mother, Jill Harrington, the editor, would have, I think, preferred that Batman was just more polished. But we thought once he had therapy, he didn't need to be Batman anymore. So it was kind of a fun chapter to write and a fun chapter to do. So that was my chapter. I think you had another question to ask me.
Well, I want to dive into this a little bit because I think the concept of the superheroes in being involved in grief experiences it's a universal thing. So they're superheroes, right? They're individual and they have their own gifts and their own powers and strengths. But underneath that, every superhero has a story.
Yeah, and it's the origin story. In Batman's case, of course, Batman's family was killed in front of him.
Right.
Parents were killed in front of him. Superman, his planet died with his parents, with his whole, with just about everybody from the planet Krypton. So I always think that Superman is interesting too from a psychological standpoint, because you a Superman fan?
Me, no. I have to say no.
But you're familiar with the story?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember what hurt Superman?
Kryptonite.
Which is what?
It was some sort of glowing stone.
Well, a fragment from his home planet.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So it kind of really reminds us that that in our origin story are often the roots of grief and difficulty.
Isn't that interesting? And so if you think about all the different heroes, and Alex, you probably know all these details way better than I do.
And certainly better than I do.
Yeah, if you think about all these different superheroes, there's backstories all connect back to loss or grief or betrayal or some type of trauma, some sort of tragic accident.
Yeah, and of course, even with betrayal, those are feelings of grief. When we lose a friend or we lose a sense of our assumptive world, this is not the world that I thought it was. That's a grief reaction. That's a trauma reaction, and they're interconnected.
Alex, did you want to add to that?
I do, yes. The trauma is almost always loss in these origin stories, but not all of the losses are strictly death losses. There is such a concept as non-death losses, and some of these characters go through non-death losses in their origin story that turns them into superheroes. And I also wish to piggyback on Dr. Ken, what he said about Superman. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were the creators of Superman, and they were Jewish immigrants to America. And so Superman, particularly in, I believe, one of the death battles he was in on YouTube series, they described Superman as an immigrant. And so Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were Jewish immigrants to America, and their struggles and their suffering were a huge inspiration on Superman. I believe the reason that he's so uber strong is because they felt powerless. And so they wanted to create something to make them, not make them feel powerful, but that their powerlessness is what contributed to, Superman's strength, why he's so strong. Another fun fact is that originally Superman was supposed to be a supervillain called Der Übermensch, but eventually they changed their minds and he became what we know today.
Interesting. So you see all these parallels. They felt powerless. They made Superman powerful. They also blew up his home planet, which for a lot of Jewish immigrants, right? They were,
especially in that era.
Yes, absolutely. So many parallels. That's very interesting. But you bring up a really good point, Alex, that a lot of our loss and our grief is not necessarily related to a death loss. It's a loss of identity, a loss of security, a loss of safety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny, we often date the field back, the academic study of grief, contemporary academic study of grief, to Freud's article on mourning and melancholia. And that was a interesting paper he wrote in 1917 about trying to differentiate grief from depression, something we still argue about and still struggle about. But what's interesting is one of the cases that Freud talks about in that article, and I think for a specific reason, I think for exactly that reason, is a jilted lover. And really talking about the disruption of a relationship, not by death, but just, by interpersonal whatever. So I think Freud was trying to give us a message, which took us a long time to learn, that grief is not about death. Grief is about loss, which can come in many ways. Of course, death certainly is one of the most severe and most permanent of those losses, but it's not the only thing that generates grief.
Right. Loss comes in all sorts of different forms.
Exactly.
Like Alex, when you look at your story, you can say, oh, yes, you had these so very deeply impactful losses, the loss of your dad and the loss of your grandparents, but you include your family dog in there because those are very personal and very deep losses as well. Wouldn't you say?
I agree. And something that, for me, whenever I think back on them, or I end up, whenever, I encounter something, mom tells me, oh, your father used to do this, da, 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 your father experienced this, da, da, da. I think of a quote from WandaVision, which also happens to be named of a song. What is grief if love persevering? I believe is the quote. And I also wish to correct myself earlier. Seidel and Schuster were first-generation Jewish sons of Jewish immigrants. They were not actual immigrants, but they were first-generation sons.
But it's still a big part of their story, the big part of their legacy. Absolutely. Alex, I want to ask you, what are 3 things you would want people to know about people with autism who are grieving?
Well, for me, it would be to harken back to what I said earlier, to find your UGT, find your unique way of grieving, what helps you the most. But also, it's to rely on your support system. I got very lucky with how amazing my support system is. My mom, my stepdad, my sister, all of my family and friends. My mom spent 2 decades building up this support system for me, and I will forever be grateful for that. And I think that you should do the same. You should rely on your support system, or in more unfortunate scenarios, if you do not have one you can rely on, is go out and create one. That's really for me. And for the third one, it's there's really only 2 pieces of advice I have for now.
That's pretty big, though. That's huge. To look for your support people, and if you don't have any, then build a community of people that can support you. I think that's incredibly valuable knowledge. Dr. Doka, before we close, tell my listeners again how people can access these resources and who they would be good for.
Okay. And again, just want to reiterate that anyone who's interested in autism, in adults, will find these resources valuable. So, but the website, autismandgrief.org, is built for really 3 groups of people. Again, persons, adults with autism, their family and their friends, their intimate network, and then professionals. So any of those would benefit, and people who are just interested. I think there are just huge resources there. I just, and I was part of the involvement, but I'm still, I think the Hospice Foundation created with the NLM Foundation just a wonderfully strong and unique resource that I think will be of great benefit to a largely neglected population. So I'm very proud to have been involved in that project.
I agree. I think the resources there are incredible. I've been into the website, and I think for grief and bereavement workers in end-of-life care, there are some great resources there. Never judge a book by its cover. Never make assumptions about how people are grieving. Alex, what would you add to that?
I would I'd like to add that you're based off your comment of assumptions. I have a very quote I like to live by: "Assumption's the mother of all failures." And so that's the quote that I live by. And for me, I would say that you shouldn't just assume that a person is fine, whether with autism or not, who's grieving is fine just because they're acting fine. And it's for me, you shouldn't be afraid to go out and ask. If they need help, then you should encourage them. Hey, say it's okay to, go out and ask for help. Do not be afraid. That's the greatest lesson my mother ever taught me, was to not be afraid to reach out and ask for help, because that's the greatest show of strength you can ever pull off, is knowing when you cannot handle something yourself and allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to show weakness and reach out for help.
I think that sounds like one of your superpowers, Alex.
You could say it is.
Definitely. You guys, thank you so much. I will have links in the show notes to the Hospice Foundation of America and to your website for the Autism and Grief resources. Thank you so much for a great conversation, guys.
Of course.
Thank you for having us on.
Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.